the Education Summit today. Proud to be partners with Dr. P and all the great work that they do. So you know that our practice in the money management world, if you will, we serve numerous not-for-profits, education institutions, scholarship funds, and some global educational organizations. So what y'all do is very important to our beliefs and also our professional lives. And I think today, before I introduce our first panel, I wanted to start off a discussion briefly about the topic of compounding. Compounding is something that we deal with day to day in the money management world, and that is compounding of capital, compound interest, and things like that. But compounding can be attributable to just about everything in life, and it's easiest to be understood, if you will, if you consider it as the cumulative impact of a behavior in one direction, and it can magnify. And I think the easiest way to explain this and put some numbers to it, I wanted to use the story of the history of the creator of chess to hammer this home. So in history, long ago, in a kingdom, a creator of a game presented this new game of chess to the emperor. And the emperor was so taken back by this game of chess that he basically announced to the kingdom that everyone must learn to play chess. This will teach you strategy, judgment, tactics, everything. This is one of the greatest things we could ever have bestowed upon us. And as a reward to the creator of chess, he said, I grant you one wish of anything that you desire. And the creator said, fine, I would like some rice. And the emperor said, well, that's ridiculous. You can have anything in the world, and you want rice. He said, but I haven't told you how I'd like my rice. He said, I'd like you to take the chessboard and task your people to place 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 grains of rice on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and so on and so forth, till you get to the 64th square. And the emperor immediately said, fine, it's done. Well, unfortunately, the emperor didn't understand the power of compounding, because 2 to the 64th power is 18 million trillion. That's enough rice to cover the entire surface of the planet. So, again, subsequently, realizing that the emperor realized he had been duped, he had the creator beheaded. But anyway, the impact, the unknowing impact of compounding can be significant. And the reason we bring this forth is, in terms of almost anything in life, strategy, judgments, and behaviors that continue down a continuous path can have a far larger compounded effect. And that crosses, I think, education as well, whether we're talking about rising costs or just the general direction of education. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce a gentleman who's going to lead the first panel. This is Dr. Robert Archibald. He is currently the administrator and professor of economics at the College of William and Mary. He chaired the economics department from 1986 to 1991, served as an interim dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for 1996-97 academic year, and as a director of the Thomas Jefferson Program in Public Policy from 2000-2004. His current research focuses on the issues of higher education and has co-authored the book, Why Does College Cost So Much? So please welcome Dr. Archibald to the stage.
Yeah, why don't the rest of the panel come forward? Well, when I was told that I was in charge of this panel, I decided that the only appropriate thing to do was to go in reverse alphabetical order. So John Zogby, who will be our first presenter, and take away, John.
Okay. Well, thank you. All those years of Catholic school for me, that never happened. I was always right by the radiator in the last seat in the last row. Dr. P, right over there, thank you very much. I met Dr. P about 15 years ago, and he told me that he had formed a do tank and not a think tank, and I have shared that quote everywhere I've been over the last 15 years. I think that's actually very cool. Let me just get right into this and get started. What we are facing in higher education, in education today worldwide, is actually part of a broader revolution that's taking place. And without getting into too many details, actually all top-down tradition-based models are heading towards obsolescence worldwide. Government, politics, church, NGOs, media, higher education, whatever. The most dangerous words in the English language, and probably the most dangerous words in any language, are the following. We are going to continue doing things the way we have always done them. Those just don't work anymore. And so moving on to higher education, there are the following challenges. Number one in higher education in this country is the return on investment. We're in a situation now, it's not only the Great Recession, but the broad changes in our economy. Both students and parents are asking, well, just what do I get in return for this tremendous investment? With full knowledge that by not making the investment in higher education, they also stand to lose. Secondly, and worldwide, meeting the needs of that explosion of the C class. So we not only have hundreds of millions of new people moving from dire poverty into at least what we might call lower middle class, but with that come tremendous higher expectations. That's what the Arab Spring is all about. That's what the spring worldwide is all about. And thirdly, in this country first, but you're going to begin to see it worldwide, the revolt of the major donors. Very simply, private institutions already reporting that major donors are beginning to balk and to say, hey, look, you asked us, we gave, and you built a sushi bar for incoming freshmen, and now you're coming back and you're asking me for the same amount. Where's the return on my investment? So with all that said, this is the era of the demand-driven, the nimble, the entrepreneurial in all institutions, and particularly in higher ed. I have spent the last decade or so polling and explaining millennials, what I call our first global citizens, not only here in the United States, but also worldwide. They are making their own world. They will continue to make their own world. It's incumbent upon the rest of us to catch up with them, their needs, and what they are defining. What is their world? Let's list them. Number one, we're moving from a jobs economy to a gig economy. According to Alan Blinder, today's 20-somethings can expect to have 4 gigs by the age of 30 and 10 by the age of 40. As Dr. P, I think, eloquently put, higher education is not about training people for their first job, but as well for their second job, third job, and beyond. That means that young people need to be, and in fact are planning to be, entrepreneurial. Now let's explain what that means. Entrepreneurial, not in the sense that they are all going to go out and start businesses, but yes, in the sense that they're going to require all the skills that one needs in starting a business to defining their path and surviving in a gig economy. They're going to need to be nimble. They're going to need to be multi-skilled. They're going to need to be looking at the horizon while they're performing and surviving in their current project. Number 2, what are the key skills? Content is important, But perhaps we've put too much of an emphasis in higher education on content. What is needed are those very skills that produce success and a multifaceted approach to a number of gigs. Decision making, response to diverse situations, teamwork, consensus building, conflict resolution, imagination. Those are the premium skills of today and into the future. Number 3, embracing the role of technology. We are moving slowly, but then it will be rapidly away from brick and mortar focused education and more into online and virtual education. There is a shakeout that will be taking place in higher education that is right around the corner, which means that some schools won't survive, other schools will simply consolidate, and the university of the future will be nimble as one can possibly imagine, so that students will not be simply registering and enrolling in one university, but going to a university that will broker a broad-based global program to meet their needs. Video games. This is something that I've had to learn as an employer and as a parent. Sometimes it gets a little ridiculous, I will say. I spoke at the University of Wilmington about 6 weeks ago, and I was told by a member of the Workplace Development Board for the state of Delaware. He was Chief Operations Officer for the Delaware State Police, and he said, would you believe that 2 weeks ago I had a 23-year-old state trooper call me and say, I can't come in and do my shift 45 minutes before the shift. Why? Because the game that he was playing, his team was invading Mogadishu. Yes, he was invading Mogadishu. And he was needed more in that game than he was needed. But you know what? My job is to interpret and to deconstruct. And yes, that's about the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. And also, given the fact that it was a state trooper, it was also pretty dangerous. On the other hand, we need to embrace this kind of identification and this kind of change. If young people are drawing their identity as much from their virtual identity as they are from their real identity, we need to understand what's going on. More importantly, if that person feels more empowered and feels more necessary as part of a team, winning a game, than their real life job, we need to understand that. Maybe not embrace it, but at least understand it. Fourthly, what I would say, and none of this I realize is very new, but what I would say is we need to watch the community colleges. They define the nimble kinds of institutions that will steer their way through this revolution. Why? They're on the front lines. When the economy sours, when the economy turns, they are the ones that need to ensure that they are meeting the needs of their community's economy. If there are opportunities, a new industry, it's the community college that's there. If there's retraining that's necessary in order to attract new industry, the community colleges are there. We need to pay very, very close attention to the successful community colleges. I'm proud to say that I started my career teaching community college, and I'm also now the chairman of the capital campaign of that very community college where I first started, and I'm so proud of the job it is doing. But as I look at community colleges and their associations throughout the country, I see that many of them are riding this wave very successfully. Those are just some initial thoughts. Thank you.
And then representing 1 million people to the state parliament at the age of 25, having chucked my green card from the US and gone back to India with a view to contest an election, and it's been a long way since then, and one continues to try and look at various things from different points of view. Let me first give you the economic scenario as it was when India gained independence and what happens today. Immediately after independence, that is in the 50s, we just had schools which were owned by government, which gave higher education. So the only schools which gave higher education were the ones which were owned by government. The tuition fees were as good as nil. And the situation was that you had, in the initial stages, 100,000 people applying for 10 seats. As time passed by, it kept on increasing and reached a stage where the 10 seats were applied for by 1 million people. And it's only the bright of the brightest who would get, say, 98.9% or so in their math and science and other subjects were the ones who got admission. It was in the late 70s that India decided to open up a bit, and it was much later, that's around the 90s, that the private institutions were permitted. When the private institutions came into being, you had the initial euphoria of private colleges, engineering colleges, medical colleges, being permitted to impart education with a permission to charge what they wanted. This was seen by a lot of people as an opportunity to make good amount of money. Though technically what was required of the private college and the university was very simple, that you ought to be non-profit making. On record, what appeared to be a non-profit making institution was really converted into private profit-making businesses by a few people who gave the infrastructure that was essential and took advantage of the shortage of education. We have now reached a stage where we have had substantial amount of private investment going into education. So much so that the organizations giving education, higher education through the private enterprises have reached a stage wherein they have become totally unaffordable to a large section of people. The school education, from the school education itself, in Bombay, for school, one has to pay an equivalent of ₹1 million a year to get school education. Undergraduate courses for engineering and others also charge substantial amount of money, making sometimes it cheaper for those who can afford that kind of education to go anywhere in other countries. And then you have the Australian universities, the New Zealand universities, the UK, and of course the US university trying to get a chunk of this pie by taking the best of the students who can afford. What happens to those who cannot afford? They have the talent, they have the wherewithal, but they do not have the money. And they continue to be deprived of higher education. The jobs, on the other hand, are for those who have the real knowledge and not the higher education. Would you venture to find out from the latest statistics of the income tax that we have, the highest earners are not the PhDs, not the postgraduates, but the highest income tax payers are the ones who fix the cell phones, who fix the televisions, who fix the cable networks, and they make the kind of money that people cannot imagine. With a country having the highest number of cell phone users, any change to be done in the cell phone means big amount of money. And the person doesn't require a graduation or a post-graduation to do that. He just requires basic knowledge of how to fix things. With the growing economy and a bit of prosperity coming to the rural side, we have two distinct sections of the society. A, the rural population, which is declining with migration from rural India going into urban India, and B, the increasing urban population. Giving an example of the city where I was born and I represent the city at the state parliament, Mumbai. If you were to make a list of those who have adequate shelter and those who do not have adequate shelter, it makes a very interesting reading. 6 million people live in slums, which is informal sector. 2.5 million people live in old and dilapidated buildings, which have outlived their effective lifespan. Another 2 million people live in staff quarters provided by their employers, not knowing where to go once they retire from their jobs or even have to leave the jobs. The example cited very often is the example of the conservancy department of the municipal corporation, where people have taken employment for 6 or 7 generations, and the job is to clean the toilets and clean the roads, only because the job provides for accommodation. And presently, you have postgraduates working in the conservancy department just because there is accommodation provided. With this kind of a situation, one comes to a stage wherein one realizes that the deprivation of higher education to a vast majority of people, either you got to be really the smart ones, that is 1% of the population, or you got to be a wealthy person who can afford higher education. The rest, despite showing, I know of a person who had 97.6% education marks and yet could not get admission to an engineering college. The net result, what has been happening is the cost of education in the developed countries increasing by the day. A new model seems to have been developed by which we have 7 of the Canadian universities, 2 of the Australian universities, 1 New Zealand university, setting shop in India, bringing in their students from their respective places into India, training some of the trainers within India, and then cutting on costs and taking them back for the remaining sessions. And then you have exclusive cities which are being designed to accommodate these kind of requests. So education has really become unaffordable to 98% of the population. The 2% which gets the education continues to get it, and in most cases that education has no connection whatsoever to the jobs. The jobs get created, and those who have the jobs have really to train the people. So education in that respect becomes irrelevant. We have the software companies who take 3 or 4 years of training to bring people to an international level, and then the disconnect between education and job is very clearly seen. Drastic situation requires drastic solutions. Unless one thinks beyond the conventional system of education, unless one thinks in terms of solutions which have never been thought or attempted, unless one goes beyond the regular thought processes that have gone so far into education to make jobs and education put together, get the industry and the educationists sit together and think in terms of a new epoch-making system by which education becomes not just a vehicle to get more degrees, but really makes meaningful citizens. With that, I thank you very much.
So the panel has been asked to talk about economic forces in the field of higher education. And there's a wonderful description of the parade of horribles that we're facing in higher education and the impact that may have on our ability to serve the emerging needs of society. I think of this as a value problem. So the question that we're being asked is, what's the value proposition of higher education? Does it remain stable? Is it going down? Is it going up? And the task for this talk is to set the stage for understanding how we think about value in higher education. So I think it's always good to start with some factoids. And so let's start with a few factoids. $51,681, 1989. $51,017, 2012. What do those represent? A $500 decline in real income in the United States, as measured, of course, by indexes. 100% plus, 2000 to 2012. What does that represent? Sticker price increase of tuition across higher educational institutions. A chart that tells us that real average money earnings at all educational attainment levels through the master's degree have declined over the last 12 years. And that it's only in those very small categories that embrace the PhD or the professional degrees that real income has gone up over that period. And one could ask whether those data remain constant given the decline on the legal education market, some business markets since 2012. Demography 101. What do the birth rates among citizens in the United States look like when held constant for wealth? Rich people, under 2. Poor people, over 4. The future tells us that more of our children will be coming from families with less to spend on their education. So 3 questions on sustainability that I ask in all of the audiences to which I'm asked to address about the future of higher education. So in keeping with our introduction to the panel, let's talk about compounding. Will United States institutions be able to raise their tuition 3.5% annually from now until perpetuity? Because if you go backward, over the last 20 years or so, that's been our model. So projecting forward, can we project that same projection forward? You got 2 possibilities here, yes or no. If the answer is no, that leads us to have a conversation about what we're going to do about it. But if the answer is yes, there's a second question that we need to address. Okay, so question number 2. If we can continue to raise our prices 3.5% compounding annually from now until perpetuity, can we do so and maintain the quality of the student body that will come to our institutions? Because that must assume that only rich people or people with increasing wealth will be able to continue to join our schools, and that there's a significant enough disproportion of talent among the wealthy people to sustain quality. If the answer to that question is no, we have a lot of things to talk about in higher education and what we can do to solve a problem. But if the answer to that question is yes, we have to go on to our third question. So question 3, if we can raise our tuition 3.5% annually, compounding from now until perpetuity, and maintain the quality of our academic institutions, will we also maintain their diversity? And I have not had a conversation with a rational person in higher education where the answer to all three questions is yes. I've had a lot of conversations with irrational people that think the answer to all three questions is yes, but in terms of rational evaluation, most people fall off the train someplace along those three questions. So how do we assess value? If our real incomes are declining at all stages below the highest levels of educational attainment, does that mean everyone now has to be driven to the PhD or driven to the professional degree or driven all the way up the value chain in order to be able to have a growth in their own personal achievement levels in society? Value is the problem of I am and you are. Okay, so we ask the question all the time of our students, did this higher educational experience matter in your life? Are you a better person for having gone to school, to have a university education, to achieve the levels of education you've had? And subjectively speaking, there was a clear voting with the feet that people believe their education has mattered in their lives. I am better because I have become educated. The real question that we face in society is, are you in fact better? You are better. And how do we measure you are better? It's not merely the subjective sense that someone has of having achieved a great deal and moved forward. What's the verification of that? Is our society moving forward? Are the skills you've attained ones that matter in society? And that verification and the relationship between the subjective side and the objective side are very difficult issues that higher education is trying to bridge. When we talk about the outcomes movement in higher education, the requirements of our accreditation agencies that are forcing us to think about outcomes, they are forcing us to move from the subjective to the objective. And we in higher education are doing all we can to resist that as much as possible because it is hard to measure some things. We are based on rank order thinking in higher education. What is your U.S. News and World Report ranking? It's easy, it's ordinal, 1 through a lot. And everyone wants to be closer to the 1 than the a lot. And when you look at what it is that goes into that bundling that tells someone where they're going to be a strong institution, it is not based on the output. It's not based on where people end up in society, what their skill levels look like, what they're capable of doing. It is based upon their credentials as they walk in the door and the reputation of the thing that they have become a part of. The network effect of the institution drives its ordinal ranking and reinforces the quality of the student body as measured by student numbers coming in the door. But real value, if we are to care about it, has to be about more than what you came in the door with, because we don't damage that too much. It's about what value we add to the thing that we get as it walks in the door. Super high should become super higher. Medium should become better. And measuring that becomes an important part of our business. Now, which outputs matter? Someone could say first job. I mean, the president and the secretary of education are beginning to talk about higher education report cards. Report cards that look at a couple very clearly objectively measured things. Can you repay your debt when you graduate? You have a job when you graduate. And if we are correct in the assumption that we've made today that people are going to move from job 1 to job 2 to job 10 over the course of a short period of time, does that first job matter as much as the capability of taking on increasing and more difficult responsibility through the course of life? And when do we measure that? At graduation? Downstream? Where we go? That's a really tough question. Short term, long term, the trade-off, and the measurement. Now, there's a lot of magic thinking in higher education. I'm going to talk about my favorite magic thinking because I think it's real, but I can't explain why. Critical thinking is what we do best in the United States. We train creativity, soft skills, and all these other things, as opposed to STEM, can you make things actually work and all that. And my colleague Richard Aram at NYU has said, but we are academically adrift. There's actually nothing that's taking place in terms of adding value. So our magic thinking about critical thinking, what's the metric on it? How do we measure it? How do we prove it up? And if it's employment alone, in what kind of job? Okay. So who does what? How do we manage this in the future? What are we thinking about as solutions in higher education? If the value proposition is to go up, what are we to do about it? And I think of that as a disaggregated aha moment that all of us must face as we're looking at the future of higher education. So what do I mean by that? We do essentially three things in higher education. We teach people stuff, knowledge nuggets. We teach people what to do with those knowledge nuggets by giving them applied capability of taking knowledge and using it against problem solving and situations that come to them. And we provide a value system, a way of thinking about the future, a way of looking at the world and taking from that world and creatively making solutions happen. Now those aha moments tell us that those three functions are always related, but do they all have to be done the same way? High cost, residential, in-person, face-to-face, 18 years old to 22 years old for the first bundle, and then 23 through the next bundle up to 27? Or can it be unbundled, disaggregated, taken apart, and done more effectively, more efficiently, more cost productively, if we think correctly about how to teach knowledge nuggets, which is machine doable in lots of places. And we think about skills, which is machine doable for lots of things, and project oriented for other things, so that we can partner with others outside of the academy, leaving to us in higher education that ineffable, that complicated value creating system that comes as the most important attainment in student-to-teacher interaction. How do we get there? I sometimes ask, does A squared equal A cubed? And by that I mean, if we're going to create access and affordability, do we have to use alternative means to do so? I answer it by saying yes. Because if we don't find alternatives, the first ways of getting at people with high-end residential, high-cost, face-to-face are not going down. Those costs are going to continue to rise. Subsidies. I have a little thing on third-party payers. Who pays for higher education? The mom and dad scholarship, very important. And if mom and dad's wealth is going down, bad. The US government, which is the single biggest payer of higher education in graduate education, the only thing that sort of seems to have a payoff, right? How much of the cost of higher education is paid for by the government in graduate education? Over 100%. When you look at the grant monies that walk in the door and the Graduate Plus loan, which allows students to borrow up to the cost of attendance, that's tuition plus. Is that going to stay here forever? The private market. Private market, by the way, is smarter about how they would lend. Would they lend the same money to someone who's in a major that has no ROI as someone who has a major that has an ROI? And that question has to confront us because we're subsidizing, in most universities, cross-subsidizing our majors from things that make money because they have high numbers of students paying high prices with low costs to fund the parts of the university that have much significantly greater costs. Well, if that big funding mechanism goes away, the private market isn't going to come back with a lending system that lends to people who can't get an ability to repay those loans. Okay, so I'm going to end with a very quick sort of sense of what we do about it. The world will not look the same, no duh. We're going to stratify substantially, rich people, poor people, private, public, for-profit, not-for-profit, online, hybrid, global, local, and if you don't have a system that allows you to have a competitive advantage as a university in that space, my place, NYU, Global Network University, 16 global campuses, looking at a future where we're going to take hybrid seriously by putting students from around the world in local campuses for part-time residential experiences plus full-time experiences that are funded and fueled through online. If you don't have a way to come at the system, you cannot succeed into the future and produce the kinds of people we're going to need for a growing economic system that will have very particular needs that are not going to be met with undifferentiated product of all of our universities. Thank you.
That do not meet job market demands, lack of student employability, skyrocketing tuition, and low graduation. So I'm going to take them on the three in turn. So curricula that don't meet job market demands and lack of student employability. Here's data on unemployment rates and median weekly earnings. And there's a clear payoff to getting a degree. And this was actually mentioned in the keynote address. These are unemployment rates by education level. The highest unemployment rates are for the people with less than a high school diploma. The important thing to see in this graph is the recent unpleasantness, which is very strongly represented by an upward tick in all the unemployment rates, increased the variance, right? The range of unemployment. The bottom line is people with bachelor's degree, their unemployment rates went up, but the difference between the unemployment rates for educated and uneducated expanded dramatically. So if you have higher education, your earnings will be higher and your exposure to unemployment will be lower. I think there's a real payoff to education. And so also carefully controlled studies, not just looking at the data, show that there's a real employability advantage to an education. I don't think it's really very easy to forecast which specific skills are going to be needed. I think that there's untold numbers of studies that have forecast shortages in some kinds of jobs, and those shortages have not appeared. I think what we need to do is to teach our students for the gig economy. I think that's a wonderful phrase. I think they're going to have many different jobs, and teaching them to think, to work hard, to write, and how to learn, and giving them research experiences and putting them in teams to work together, giving them basic skills is much more important than trying to figure out exactly what specific skills are going to be needed in the near-term future. So now I have to talk about skyrocketing tuition. And everyone should take a lot of time looking at the College Board publication called Trends in College Prices. It comes out every year. It's got wonderful data on what's happening to tuition and all kinds of other things. So this is for private four-year institutions. The green line is the published list price tuition. You could start to make a skyrocketing argument based on these data. But if you look at the purple lower line, that's net price. That's after you take into consideration scholarships and tuition tax credits, okay, not loans. So this is, and it's hard to make an argument about skyrocketing tuition. In fact, recently, the last few years, the net price of attending a private four-year institution has actually gone down. That is a little-known fact. But the average price is actually moderated. The story for public institutions is different. Now you really can make the rate of increase of public list price tuition is really gone up very dramatically. And so has net price, but not nearly as much. So I think an awful lot of good can be done by people taking the College Board data and looking at the net price data and stop talking about the list price data, which does matter for some people, but not very many. The number of schools that give some kind of a scholarship to the vast majority of their students is rising. Why has public list price tuition gone up so much? So here's data on the rate of increase of tuition, which is the red, and the green is the rate of increase of appropriations, the state appropriation that goes to the public institutions. And there's two very interesting things about these data. One, when appropriations go down, institutions of higher education are told, we're not going to actually announce this, but we're going to look the other way and you can raise price, because we can't raise the rent we're charging to the prisoners. Right? The state is in trouble, we're going to cut your budget, you can raise tuition. And so when the green line goes down, the red line goes up. The other thing that's very important to know about these data is the preponderance of the green lines, which are the change in appropriations, that are below zero, where appropriations per student have actually been cut. On average, the amount of subsidy going to pay for state-supported higher education is going down. So the final thing is low graduation rates. And if we're going to make a comment about what's going on in higher education, this is the place that's really a problem. So these are graduation rates, again from the Trends in College Pricing data, by the selectivity of the institutions. So the most selective institutions that let in less than 25% of their students, 88% of the students graduate from the institution they have first matriculated to. There are several that, these data aren't able to follow students to where they transfer. But the less selective institutions clearly have very low graduation rates. The overall graduation rate is 59%. That's really very poor. This is something that colleges and universities really have to work on. We have to figure out why it is that so many of our students who start don't finish. And this is the kind of thing that economists are studying. There's a wonderful article in the economics literature that I just want to highlight. They looked at whether or not the reason that completion rates are going down is the students are getting worse, or is it the resources they have are declining. And their conclusion is that increases in student-faculty ratios and larger enrollments in schools with high student-faculty ratios are a lot of the reason. It comes back to the states that are the ones that fund most of the large institutions are backing away from funding them, and the students are having to deal with many more bigger classes, much less personal interaction with faculty. Finally, I think it's important to notice, with all the problems that exist in higher education, lots of students are coming here. The students coming from elsewhere, voting with their feet, are expanding. So higher education in the United States is not perfect, but we still are attracting an awful lot of students. Thank you.